Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I am Templar, and today we are actually going to be talking about the medieval man-at-arms. Now, I hear you already, Templar, what is a medieval man-at-arms? Is it another term for knight? No. In truth, the medieval man-at-arms is the medieval term meaning of a medieval soldier. In truth, if we actually take a look at history books, we technically understand the term of a medieval foot soldier in historical manuscripts. However, that's the thing. The medieval man-at-arms technically first comes to light sometime during the early periods of its time, such as, say, during the High Medieval Age, of which we know as the era of the Crusades, which finally ends with the historical fact somewhere between the 17th or 16th century. In doing so, the man-at-arms is a historical type of unit military group that were technically used as foot soldiers in medieval times. Now, I hear you already. Templar, what and how is the man-at-arms able to be known? Well, that's kind of simple, really. Let's take a look at the background of the said medieval man-at-arms. Now, what are they? Where do they come from? Well, in truth, the medieval man-at-arms is a type of foot soldier that we do know. However, that's the thing. These are technically soldiers that are actually hired by a said nobleman or a medieval knight. For example, let's take, say, like William of Normandy, for example. He has man-at-arms, and in doing so, when he invades England during the Battle of Hastings, he technically actually does have a bunch of man-at-arms from a said surrounding region, that of which are not medieval knights. Now I hear you already. Templar, why would you say that? Well, in truth, if you take a look at the Battle of Hastings, we actually see a lot of foot soldiers, and not as many types of said knights. In fact, medieval knights actually rode into battle with their said horses. However, that's the thing. The medieval man-at-arms, or medieval foot soldier, whatever you want to pronounce it as, actually did sometimes ride horses, but however, they did not ride them into battle, nor to battle, but in truth, this was technically just used by hunting, which is extremely different. However, that's the thing. The medieval man-at-arms actually does nearly look identical to the said medieval knight. Now I hear you already. How is that even possible? Well, in truth, if you take a look at historical manuscripts, it's actually stated that the medieval man-at-arms is actually, well, near identical because he can actually pay for the said equipment. However, that's the big part, actually, that I had to explain. In truth, the man-at-arms is actually a civilian that actually lives in the said, region of the said town, for example. Now, I hear you already. Templar, how is that even possible? Well, let's take, for example, if I say live in this type of village. And in truth, I'm technically said the second-born son of a said blacksmith, or a miller's son, or a mason's son, or something like that. In doing so, I want to see the world, and in doing so, I do not want to just lie about and such, so in doing so, I start to say, well, work for a bailiff. In doing so, I'm a soldier. However, that means I'm a guard. But if I'm hired by, say, a nobleman, like, say, this type of nobleman or this medieval knight, I'm in truth that said man-at-arms of that said nobleman. In truth, these types of soldiers were actually paid very well. How much? Well, in truth, they were technically near identically paid as much as a medieval knight, nearly. However, that's the thing. They weren't exactly held up into the form of the knighthood. Now, I heard already. Templar, what does that mean? Here's the thing. They weren't knighted. In truth, they look like the medieval knight, but they're not. And one big way you can actually tell the difference is not just by looking at their armor, but also taking a look at their heels. Why their heels? Here's the thing. A medieval knight wears spurs. A medieval foot soldier, on the hand, or man-at-arms, does not. Explains the big reason behind it. Because the spurs are meant to actually spur the horse forward. So in doing so, that's the big reason. Now, I hear you already, Templar, but I play Kingdom Come Deliverance, and I see this and that. Well, here's the thing. I'll get to that very soon to explain it. But how about let's take a look at the early medieval man-at-arms, so that way we can understand it a little bit, shall we? Now, when we understand the man-at-arms in general, we kind of understand the fact, well, Templar, you stated that they were near identical. How so? Well, in truth, they could afford the same type of armor, but the thing is, they also had to afford technically different weapons. And unfortunately, during the early periods of history, it's actually stated that the man-at-arms technically had a bit of a problem. They wanted a type of weapon that was near identical to the knight. Now, in truth, they can actually manage to actually pay for a sword, for example, that a medieval knight could afford. Problem is, it would be a lot different. It would be slightly shorter, but we'll get to the weapons soon. Let's first take a look at the armor, shall we? Now, when we take a look at the helmets, we technically have to understand the fact that due to the fact that they were near identical to the medieval knight, they would actually have a near identical helmet like this, the nasal helm. However, by the time of the Second Crusade and Third Crusades, they actually switched from the said nasal helm and to the said kettle helm. In doing so, this was a lot easier for them. However, they did still actually use the nasal helm, depending on whether or not they liked wearing it or not. But in truth, though, they would technically wear it sometimes with mail and such. But that's the part that we actually have to understand. However, though, they would also wear said gambeson and mail armor. Now, I hear you already. Oh, Templar, that means that they could actually wear the same type of armor as a knight. Well, yes and no. For example, let's take a look at these two guys here. As you can see, these two, they look near identical, right? Well, here's the thing. One's a medieval knight, and one is a foot soldier. And in truth, you can actually tell by the look in the mail. For example, do you see that guy with the writing slit on the right? He is the medieval knight, and the one that is on his left is the medieval foot soldier, or man-at-arms. In doing so, his mail is not having that writing slit. Now, I hear you already. Templar, why wouldn't he have a writing slit? Well, that explains on who he is and whether or not he is a foot soldier or not. In truth, it shows that he is a foot soldier. In fact, this is actually the thing that medieval man-at-arms did. They had a type of mail that would actually work in a type of form that would actually cover the said groin area, still unlike the medieval knight, because they did not ride into battle like the medieval knight did. So yeah, this gives us a good example. In fact, this design, as you can understand, is a lot different. However, though, that's the thing. We have to understand the fact that the medieval knight is a lot different. They could afford a lot more. But in truth, though, the medieval man-at-arms actually could afford near identical armor. For example, let's take a look at this guy. This guy is wearing, well, a type of mail hauberk like habergeon with tailored sleeves and mittens, which some foot soldiers were known to wear. Problem is, not a lot of them. And in truth, only a captain, for example, could probably afford this. However, though, this gives us a good example of what it might actually look like. But in doing so, they wouldn't exactly cover their legs because, well, they're not riding into battle on a medieval horse. They're fighting in the form of military design, phalanx design, with a kite shield. So in doing so, we can understand the fact that a medieval man-at-arms would wear a habergeon design, or a hauberk-like design mail. In doing so, this would actually, well, not have a riding slit. So in doing so, this would exactly look what they would look like. But yeah, I'm sorry to actually explain this to y'all that pretty much thought that the medieval knight and man-at-arms were the same. Here's the thing, they're not. In truth, though, the man-at-arms and the medieval knight are incredibly different, but nearly identically the same. But in truth, though, it's kind of hilarious of how many people accidentally mistaken a knight for a man-at-arms. Now, I hear you already, but Templar, did they also wear the same type of padding? Well, yes. In fact, anybody back then would wear the same type of padding. That is a huge thing that people would actually wear. So, yes, they would still wear padding underneath mail. And in doing so, they could actually, most of the time, wear this type of armor or that type of armor. However, early plate armor, for example, is a harder one, for example. How so? Well, in truth, the early Norman knights wore this type of armor, which not that many types of medieval, said, foot soldiers could actually wear. In doing so, it was technically near impossible. However, by the end of the high medieval period, such as, say, the 1300s or 1400s, the brigandine started to change into this form as we see from the Outlaw King. However, that's the thing. Pretty much by the late medieval periods, people started wearing this type of armor for the foot soldier. But still though, if they could afford it, they would wear a said type of near identical armor to that of the medieval knight during the early periods. However, that's a hard thing to explain. In fact, Most of the time, though, a said man-at-arms would technically wear the same mail and armor. However, if they are said to be like down to the ranking of a buck private, for example, their armor would technically be made of gambeson, a form of mail, either of a male coif on the head or a male hauberk or habergeon, and as well with a said shield and as well helmet. However, their weapons I will get to very shortly. Now I hear you already. Templar, what about their shields? Well, as I stated before, they would use shields. However, the medieval kite shield was one of the biggest ones. In fact, the medieval kite shield had their versions. For example, the medieval knight had their version of kite shield, and the medieval foot soldier had their version. However, the medieval kite shield for the foot soldier was slightly bit wider. If y'all remember of my Crusader kite shield that I have technically bought a while back, I will leave a link down below to explain that of how identical they are to this type of said point. In doing so, though, they were technically different. But that's the thing. The medieval knight's kite shield was slightly smaller compared to the medieval foot soldier's kite shield. But in doing so, they were technically still near similar to him. For example, take a look at this image here of a medieval crusaders. One is a Templar sergeant, and the other is a Templar knight. Now I hear you already. Templar, how can you tell the difference? Well, the Templar sergeant is the guy wearing black. In doing so, this guy is actually a enlisted officer of the said Templars. In doing so, they are a lower ranked military group of the said Templar units. Now, here's the thing though. You see that they're nearly identical to the said, Templar knights, who are technically from noble houses. But that's an extreme hard thing to explain, though. We have to understand that the kite shield is an incredible part of history, that of which was technically used by many types of soldiers, but as well, medieval foot soldiers on the other hand used them extremely differently for a form of shield wall. However, though, by the time of the said 1200s and 1300s, the heater shield started to take place. However, that's the thing. The heater shield didn't exactly replace the kite shield for the said military up until somewhere between the late 1300s. So in doing so, the foot soldiers technically still kept using the kite shield rather than the heater shield. So in doing so, we had to understand the fact, why didn't they? Well, kind of obvious. Armor. Armor had to evolve into this form to actually make sure that the weapon could technically not penetrate through the said skin and such. The armor had to evolve for the said foot soldiers. So you can understand why. But now I hear you already. But Templar, what about their weapons? Well, in truth, the said foot soldiers would have weapons of their own. For example, this would actually be of a type of short sword, or including spears, warhammers, daggers, crossbows, maces, flails, cleavers, and including a type of sword known as the bastillard sword. Now, if none of y'all know what a bastillard is, take a look at these images here. The bastillard sword is an elongated version of the bastillard dagger. Now, why is it a sword and not a dagger? Well, here's the thing though. The bastillard sword would be of a different design length. In truth, these were originally daggers. However, medieval foot soldiers, what they did is they had the blade extended. In doing so, this could create a near identical sword that would be, as I stated, near identical to a said, short sword. In doing so, though, these weapons were incredibly different. How so? Well, the blade length from these would normally be somewhere between 12 and 18 to somewhere around 25 inches. Now, here's the thing. If none of y'all understand how long that blade would be a very long blade. However, still, that would be in comparison from the medieval broadsword of the time, which would be somewhere between 30 inches of blade length. Kind of like my late Viking sword, for example. However, that's the thing about these. In fact, these type of short swords were near identical to the blade length of a said dagger. Now, here's the thing though, these would be different compared to where they were. Now, however though, they would sometimes still have a said crossguard, just like a medieval broadsword. However, they would be a shorter blade. They would not be as long as a broadsword. As I stated, they would technically sometimes be only around 25 inches. Which was the mostly. However, that's the thing. Pretty much since they could still somewhat afford a same amount of weapons, it's kind of hard to near identically explain this. However, this is the type of the weapons of the high medieval period, of which are extremely different. Now I hear it already, but Templar, what about the cleaver? Well, in truth, the cleaver is used by the said foot soldiers. However, it's not used as much. It's only used in a type of form of an early design until they switched it out later on from the late medieval period for the falchion. So I hear you already, Templar, why would they switch it? Well, kind of obvious. This weapon was technically only perfect for one thing, and that's chopping and cleaving into a said human being. But the thing is, this type of weapon was perfect for him at the time, mainly because it could easily, well, kill a medieval knight, for example. However, to popular opinion, it's actually stated that the medieval man-at-arms did use one weapon that the medieval peasant did not, and that would be this, the crossbow. In fact, the crossbow was the famous weapon used by man-at-arms. In fact, the man-at-arms technically used it from the Battle of Hastings all the way leading up to technically the 100 Years' War, and in truth, it's actually kind of be understood of why these crossbows were used, but in doing so, they were later on evolved over time. Now I hear you already, but Templar, did they also use bows? Well, that's the thing, it was both a yes and a no. In truth, this can actually be seen hard to explain. Why? Well, it's kind of obvious. Most people don't understand that most of the time, this was technically a near impossible type of weapon to be seen on the medieval battlefield used by said regular man-at-arms. However, there's also another weapon that they could have also used, such as the dagger and knife. However, though, knives were technically one of the biggest things they would have used, such as this, the sax. Now, why the sax? Here's the thing, the sax could have actually been forged enough or elongated enough that it can actually be viewed as a small, short sword. And in doing so, this is technically, well, kind of what it is. In truth, if you were to actually measure it against a Viking broadsword like this, you can actually see near identically, these are near identical of a blade length. So, yeah, these are technically what medieval crusading foot soldiers would have probably used. Now, remember when I stated about the falchion? Well, by the high medieval periods, or late high medieval periods, it's actually stated at this point in time, these types of swords evolved from the said cleaver and into the said weapon, as you see. However, that's the thing, these type of swords would technically have emerged sometime around the said timeline of the 3rd or 4th Crusade. So, yeah, we can probably understand why. So, but the thing is, why would they actually evolve it that way? Well, in truth, you gotta understand, these are foot soldiers. They want a good weapon that can not just fight against, said, a guy like this or a guy like that. They also want a weapon that can easily be used for chopping, but also thrusting. In doing so, the falchion was a good design for them. In doing so, many historians actually state that they copied this type of design from, said, Islamic Turks, or some Saracens, as they many called them. In doing so, it evolved it into this type of chopping, but yet thrusting design form, perfect for their form of combat, which you gotta admit, it's kind of a good idea for them, especially if they're going up, say, against a medieval knight wearing mail armor. And in fact, it actually has been stated at the Battle of Santarito, at least 10 men-at-arms actually used these type of swords, especially facing off against 13 medieval knights who were technically outclassing them in arms and armor. And yet, these supposed 10 medieval men-at-arms fought off against these said knights, and only at least 7 of them survived, which, all in all, it's kind of impressive that they managed to survive a near onslaught. However, what about their spears? Well, in truth, their spears would be a lot different during the high medieval period. How so? Well, that's the thing. We gotta understand the fact that these guys were still hiding behind their shields, unlike the medieval serfs or peasant soldiers, which were using two-handed pike-like spears. Now, if y'all want to see a video on that, I will leave a link down below for y'all, so that way you can understand my point about this. However, that's the thing. The medieval man-at-arms would technically have still used the spear-type weapon behind their kite shield and such, rather than go with a two-handed polearm. Now, why? Kind of obvious. They still actually had enough money to pay for this, but that's the thing. This is before the said medieval plate armor came around, so we can understand that we can see that they were a lot different. However, another weapon they could have probably mostly used would be the warhammer or mace. However, that's the thing. It varies time to time of what it might have been used. but you can understand why. But now let's get to the late medieval type man-at-arms, shall we? Now, as I stated before, in Kingdom Come Deliverance, for example, we do see groups of said man-at-arms. However, that's the thing. The man-at-arms, as many people, especially with one guy I pretty much know, who's probably commenting away and not listening to the video, in the process doesn't realize that man-at-arms couldn't afford as great a plate armor as a said medieval knight. In fact, many people think that a man-at-arms looks like this, but in truth would most likely look like this. In doing so, man-at-arms have different forms. Now, as I stated before, a man-at-arms can technically reach from enlisted ranks of a sergeant or including a captain, such as Captain Bernard, for example, who technically does wear a form of plate armor. However, as we can see, that's all forms of plate armor he could probably wear, due to the fact he's technically being paid to do his job. He's technically not a medieval nobleman, who of which technically gets money for technically doing nothing. So you see my point? But see, that's the thing. In truth, the man-at-arms actually does get paid a certain amount of money depending on their rank. This is technically like the medieval version of the enlisted soldier. But how about we take a look more into their body armor, shall we? Now, when we take a look at their armor in truth in general, it would be a lot different. For example, let's take a look at, say, some of their mail. Now, in truth, they would still keep the historical habergeon look, of which was technically historic. And in truth, mail was actually one of the biggest things they would have worn. However, they would have also sometimes worn different versions of mail or plate type design, or sometimes not even wear mail at all and just wear gambeson and plate armor, seeing as though it was slightly a little cheaper for them to manufacture. However, though, it would still depend whether or not they wanted to get this weapon and armor or equipment, because that's the thing. These guys couldn't outfit themselves with heavy suits of armor. They weren't a medieval knight. However, though, they can sometimes actually afford armor for the legs. As you can see, this little figurine here, he's actually wearing a form of plate armor on his leg. However, that's the thing. This type of leg armor, that's all he would technically wear. In truth, this would actually pretty much protect the thigh region, it would protect the knees, and somewhat of the shin. However, that's about it. In truth, though, these would be a lot different compared to the medieval plate armor of the said medieval knight, who of which would actually be outfitted a lot more than a said man-at-arms. But see, that's the thing we have to understand. Man-at-arms could not afford said heavy-duty plate armor. They had to pay for what they got. They couldn't just go into the store and say, oh, I want to buy the greatest sets of armor. I want to buy a cuirass. I want to buy a helmet. I want to buy this and that. And in the process, here's the thing. Things back then were a lot more expensive and hard to get than they are today. Not because of class system, because technically these are citizens of a said town. They are technically a, well, regular civilian. In doing so, they are not like the medieval serf. But the thing is, they couldn't afford the same types of good armor of a medieval knight. But alright, what about their helmets? Well, they would still keep the kettle hat look. However, they would slowly evolve to getting this, the bassinet. Now, there were different versions of bassinet they would wear. For example, sometimes they would wear the nasal bassinetta, or sometimes a bassinet with no form of face protection. Or sometimes, if they could manage to get them with face protection, but they would be different designs. Which, yeah, you can understand. However, sometimes there would be sallets, there would be this design, there would be many designs. However, the biggest one would always be the kettle helm, which we can understand why. It's a lot easier for you to view your openings, you can actually hear a lot better. However, the bassinet and kettle helm are one of the biggest ones that a foot soldier would normally wear. So, yeah, we can see why. However, let's take a look at the coat of plates, or brigandine. Now, this type of armor is big. Why? Here's the thing. This is the type of armor that most medieval foot soldiers would actually wear, rather than the cuirass. In doing so, the coat of plates, or brigandine, is a really good example. In fact, Scala Gladiatoria did a video on his brigandine, which does give a good example of what a late medieval said foot soldier would wear with mail brigandine and a type of helmet of some sort. It depended on their said region. However, let's take a look at this image here of a said medieval foot soldier. He actually is wearing a said brigandine, a very late brigandine type plate armor, with a sallet, and including also with a said forms of arm protection. However, that's the thing. He could have probably paid for that generally, but we don't really know, because that's the thing. There are different versions over time. However, as we can see, he's not wearing any leg armor. This shows that he was a foot soldier. Why and how? Well, it's kind of hard to explain, but see, that's the thing. He could have probably said paid for this armor in the process, or in the process he could have probably taken this off a dead body. However, technically that's the hard part to explain, really, and in truth it would be near hard to explain. However, let's take a look at this figurine, as we can see, of a medieval foot soldier blowing into a horn. As we can see, he's wearing a form of early brigandine for a said foot soldier. In doing so, as you can tell, this is near identical. You would wear mail, brigandine, helmet, and such. This is technically a good example of it. But that's the thing. However, some medieval foot soldiers did not get all that chance, like this guy, who is using a falchion, heater shield, and mail, and technically in gambeson and helmet. That's about it. So, yeah, you can see the big problem there. But that's the thing. Brigandine armor would be a lot different and a lot more hard to explain, for example, for them to use. For example, at the Battle of Visby, as it's also known, or the Massacre at Visby, medieval militiamen or men-at-arms would have actually worn this. This, as you can see, is a lot different. Now, here's the thing though, as I stated before, men-at-arms are technically people that were, well, civilians or citizens of a said town or region that were being paid by their noble lord. In doing so, they would technically get paid a lot, and sometimes militiamen were that, or another form of them. But that's the thing. In fact, some of them would actually look like this, which, that's the thing. Many times over, the medieval men-at-arms had different forms of plate armor at this time. But we could see the brigandine, for example, this type of the brigandine is a good example of the very late brigandine that would have been used by a said foot soldier. In truth, these type of armors were incredible for them to use. Now here already, what about the cuirass? What about other forms of body armor? As we take a look at this Swiss mercenary, he's technically wearing a form of cuirass and such, but here's the thing. He probably earned this on the battlefield, ladies and gentlemen. He probably was fighting extremely gruesomely, and it was paid extremely well to get this armor. In doing so, that's the thing. Many times over, mercenaries or captains would have actually gotten great plate armor like this. In doing so, would have actually been near identical. But see, that's the hard thing to explain. Medieval men-at-arms did not get that much form of armor when it came to plate. In fact, even their leg armor was incredibly hard to get their hands on, and it was various over times. But you can see my point. Even their arm armor was a form known as the Jack of Chains, that of which was strapped onto the gambeson. But the thing is, this is harder to explain to y'all because when we take a look at history, there are different versions that we have to understand. But now, here's the thing though. They would technically use the heater shield, but also the buckler. Now, that's another thing we got to understand though. But in truth, as I can already hear you already, Templar, what about their arm armor? Well, that's the thing. Their arm armor would vary over time, depending on their class of system, on how rich they were and such. But in truth, a medieval foot soldier would want to fight incredibly light. He wanted to be effective enough on the battlefield. But the thing is, he technically needed to be extremely durable. But by the very late medieval period and the early Renaissance, their armor would technically, well, yeah, you see my point. They would change. But that's the thing, though. When we take a look at the buckler shield, it's technically another viewpoint of them of actually using it. In fact, many foot soldiers did use bucklers by the late medieval period. Not because it was, well, cheap, but because it was effective. And in doing so, it actually worked for them. But now I hear already, Templar, what about their weapons of the late medieval period? Well, that's the hard part to explain, really. In truth, they actually, by the very late medieval period, they would have technically gotten rid of the shield most of the time and gone mainly for pole weapons, such as the pole arms that were used by medieval serfs, or the peasant soldiers, for example, that of which give a good example to it. In fact, If none of y'all remember my video on the medieval peasants soldier, I will leave a link down below for y'all so that way you can understand my point. Now, many of these weapons would be the pole hammer, or the halberd, the glaive, or including the bill hook. There are many designs out of which could have been used like this. And in doing so, yes, you could actually pay for these types of weapons, and in doing so, these could work for you. So yes, these are a lot different compared to the peasant soldier, that of which was just given the said weapon. In doing so, you couldn't actually get a chance to even get a good one. So you can see why these weapons were a lot different. But yeah, though many times over, they would not use a two-handed flail. They would not use the flail at all. So we could probably see why these were technically getting rid of. But you can see my point though. These things were incredibly gruesome still, and are actually. However, the one type of late medieval type of weapon that would actually be used would actually be the halberd. The halberd was one of the foot soldiers' greatest weapons. In fact, the medieval man-at-arms were mainly famous mainly because they were using the said halberd design weapon. In truth, these were technically different designs. Sometimes they had a hammer and spike and an axe, or sometimes it was one spike and two spikes and a blade, kind of like this. Oh, you can see my point though. But see, that's the thing. This depended on the fact if they actually were able to even manage to pay for this. Because see, they had to pay for these weapons while the medieval serfs did not. But now, what other weapons you might ask? Well, they would also use a weapon. They would still technically use the said falchion. However, this would later turn into the messer, or should I say the cleaver, into the said messer. Now in doing so, that's the thing. They could also technically pay for a said arming sword, for example, but in truth, that's the thing. The medieval foot soldier, for example, could not exactly use the medieval arming sword as the same as, the said medieval knight. In truth, they actually had to find a weapon that was both perfect for cutting and thrusting for themselves, and that would most of the time been the falchion, the messer, or including the cleaver. However, by the late medieval period, the Germanic or Holy Roman Empire most of the time used messers for their military, or in this case, hunting swords, if many of y'all play Kingdom Come Deliverance. In doing so, these weapons are a good example, because these were cheaper, but yet near identical to a said falchion. In doing so, these kind of were perfect for them, and as well, they liked these enough because they guarded the said, opening end of their, back end of their hands. But as well, there would even be two-handed type messers, known as the Großmesser, that of which were incredibly dangerous. However, there were sometimes small thrusting type swords like this, that would have actually been used. However, these were very rare to actually see on a said person of a foot soldier, because most of the time, foot soldiers used chopping and thrusting weapons like the cleaver, the falchion, or the messer, and of which we can understand why. Because, these are perfect for them. In fact, these are short and yet perfect for them to actually combat against said combat. These are not medieval knights, ladies and gentlemen. These are foot soldiers. However, there would be a later on type cleaver like this that some medieval knights actually stated that was against the rules of war. However, foot soldiers just didn't care, because this weapon can actually cleave through the helmet extremely gruesomely. However, these type of weapons were later on disbanded because the amount of metal was actually required to make it. And we could probably see why many foot soldiers wouldn't pay for this when they could probably just pay for a messer or a Großmesser rather than this. However, as I stated prior, the medieval foot soldier would mainly be famous because of the crossbow. In fact, in the 100 Years' War, for example, many foot soldiers would rather use the crossbow. As we could see, this one was actually wearing plate armor as well in a type of forms. This gives us a good example compared to this one of a late medieval crossbowman as well, also wearing a form of brigandine. However, they would also use these massive tower shields with them. Now, how would they use these? As you can actually see in this image here, they would actually plop them down right in front of them. Literally, they would carry these shields, plop them down in front of them, and in the process, this would help them reload and fire. This is not a total war game, ladies and gentlemen. This is historical to what it would look like. However, though, there is also this image of a said Scandinavian period of a crossbowman actually using a type of crossbow with his liege lord, and as well he's also wearing a brigandine and using a type of shield, which this gives us a good example also. But that's the thing. There are many types of man-at-arms that use different designs of armor and crossbows with the said type of gear. However, that's the thing. They were only paid like at least 4 pennies. Now, if y'all don't understand, Templar, does that mean like 1 cent? No. Pennies back then was technically, yes, a piece of copper. However, these copper pennies were worth a lot more than they are today. How so? Well, I'll probably have to do I'll probably have to do medieval currency some other time, but you see my point. For example, 4 copper pennies can actually equal up to a said 1 silver coin, and at least 5 silver coins could turn up into a gold coin. You see my point. In fact, the Spanish created the pieces of 8, which actually give us a good example for that. So, yeah, you see my point though, but that's the thing. Each one of these actually does give a good example. But in truth, that's the thing. The medieval crossbowmen actually only got paid at least 4 pennies a day or 4 pennies a battle, of which we could pretty much see why, because these were extremely easy things to do on the medieval battlefield. So yeah, it's kind of not so fun to be a medieval crossbowman. However, another weapon they would also be famous for is this, the hand cannon. Now, the hand cannon, I hear you already. Templar, why the hand cannon? Here's the thing. The hand cannon was probably the most dangerous weapon on the medieval battlefield. In fact, I did a video on this a while back. If y'all want to see it, I will leave a link down below for y'all. So that way you can understand the points of these type of guns and what they would have looked like. And how these would have pretty much turned into this, the arquebus. In fact, the late medieval period and early Renaissance, or technically in a colonial period, these type of arquebuses would have been used like this. However, though, that's the thing. The hand cannon was one of the most dominant type of destruction weapons on the medieval battlefield. And here's the thing. These would not go for plate armor like you do see in movies. However, these would be used on foot soldiers and horses. So, yeah. You could say bye-bye to your horse, medieval knight, because you're technically going down as soon as you get hit by this hand cannon. Of which many foot soldiers like this that were using the gunpowder or the said type of hand cannon were actually getting paid at least 14 pennies for every fight. Depends. It's kind of hard to explain, really. It depended on the said region. However, by the very late medieval period, the most greatest weapon of the foot soldier finally came into play. And that would be the great sword, the Zweihänder, the claymore. There are many names for them, but in truth, they always lead to one thing, a massive great sword. Now, why would foot soldiers get these weapons? Well, in truth, if we take a look at history, the medieval foot soldier technically wanted a weapon that was perfect enough to chop at the legs of horses and as well cut down said, well, medieval pikes. And in truth, those type of soldiers that actually carried these said great swords would actually be paid a massive amount of money. Now, if y'all don't know how dangerous these weapons were, in truth, these could cut right through the legs of a said, well, medieval horse, and as well they could cut into the ranks of a pike formation, of which, that's the thing. If you were to see a said medieval soldier, for example, such as a Landsknecht, who of which would have actually worn a massive amount of plate armor, and of which, that's the thing. These guys would have actually charged headlong into a massive pike formation, killing technically hundreds, in fact. In fact, these guys were feared from the battlefield. Same thing as the Gallowglass, who used their type of claymore sword, for example, were also feared from the battlefield because of their way of fighting. But see, that's the thing. These swords are incredibly gruesome. These were not meant to be used as what you might think. However, that's the thing though. You can actually probably take this an executioner sword and sharpen it down to make it like this. But see, these swords in general were incredibly horrifying on the medieval battlefield. In truth, medieval plate armor started to play into the fact for the said, well, knight, for the said man-at-arms. In fact, man-at-arms actually loved the great sword, and in the process, it's actually stated that Maximilian actually favored the Landsknecht who are actually using this weapon a lot more than they did firearms or anything else. But you can see why. Well, y'all, I hope that helps y'all out in understanding history of the man-at-arms and as well their arms and armor. Now, if y'all want to actually try and do your best of creating your own man-at-arms version from this list. Be my guest. But please keep it accurate, folks. We don't want some LARPers playing reenactor. Anyways, guys, hopefully you liked this video, and also please like and subscribe. Also, click that bell button for notifications for the next upcoming video. Also, check out our Facebook, so that way you can understand which next video we're going to come up with. Anyways, guys, also let me know in the comments below if you all want me to talk about anything historical down here, and I will be happy to do so. Anyways, guys, this has been Templar. Have a great day.